5-year-old twins Lucia and Sophia stood frozen in disbelief as their father's luxury SUV disappeared down the dusty Hacienda road, abandoning them like unwanted baggage at a stranger's fence. Only Marengo, an aging white stallion with knowing eyes, witnessed their cruel betrayal and decided this injustice would not stand. The sprawling Martinez estate lay silent under the scorching Texas sun, its weathered fence posts marking the boundary between wealth and the dusty roads of Cielo County. At 48, Richard Martinez embodied everything the locals despised about new money: arrogant, disconnected, and perpetually dissatisfied. His sleek black Cadillac Escalade crawled along the gravel driveway leading to his father's hacienda, dust billowing behind like ghosts chasing the vehicle. In the back seat, 5-year-old twins Lucia and Sofia Martinez sat quietly, their identical chestnut curls framing faces that mirrored their late mother's delicate features. 6 months had passed since Elena's heart had given out unexpectedly, leaving Richard with 2 small daughters he'd barely known while his wife was alive. "Are we almost there, Daddy?" Sophia's small voice barely carried over the air conditioning. Richard's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. "Yes, your grandfather is expecting you." It was the first of many lies he would tell that day. In truth, old man Carlos Martinez had no idea his granddaughters were coming. Richard hadn't spoken to his father in nearly 3 years, not since the explosive argument over his treatment of Elena. Carlos had accused his son of neglecting his family, of prioritizing business deals and weekend trips to Vegas over his wife's deteriorating health condition. Richard had stormed out, vowing never to return to the outdated wasteland his father called home. Yet here he was, with a plan that made his stomach turn even as his mind had settled on its necessity. "Look, girls," Richard pointed toward a large oak tree near the property's entrance. "That's where your mom used to play when she was little." Another lie. Elena had never set foot on the Martinez estate until she'd married Richard, but the twins wouldn't know that. At 5, their memories were still forming, malleable things that Richard counted on fading with time. "Did Mommy climb it?" Lucia asked, pressing her small palms against the window. "All the time," Richard answered, his voice hollow. He checked his Rolex, 2:15 p.m., perfect timing. His father would be napping, as he always did in the afternoon heat. The ranch hands would be working the north pastures, far from the main house. His plan required this temporary emptiness. The twins had matching backpacks, pink with silver stars for Sophia, purple with gold moons for Lucia. Inside each, Richard had packed a change of clothes, a small stuffed animal, and an envelope with a brief note explaining who the girls were. No contact information, no promises of return. Since Elena's death, Richard had felt like he was drowning. His real estate development company demanded constant attention. The nannies quit one after another, claiming the girls were too much work. His golf membership had lapsed. His girlfriend, Veronica, had started making noise about their future together, while making it clear that future didn't include raising another woman's children. "Something has to give," his therapist had told him during their last session. Richard had nodded, already formulating his solution. He parked the Escalade near the grand wooden fence that surrounded the main corral, where several horses grazed lazily in the afternoon sun. One, a magnificent white stallion with a gray speckled mane, lifted his head as the car approached. "Okay, girls, let's play a game," Richard said, forcing brightness into his voice. "I need you to stand by the fence and count all the horses you see. I'm going to park the car in the garage, and then I'll come find you." "But Daddy, it's hot," Sophia whined, already sweating in her light summer dress. "Just for a few minutes," Richard insisted, helping them out of their car seats. Your grandfather will be so impressed if you can tell him exactly how many horses he has. It'll be our surprise for him." The twins exchanged uncertain glances but nodded. They'd been raised to obey without question. Richard placed their backpacks on the ground beside them. "Hold on to these. They have your water bottles inside." He watched as they walked obediently to the fence, their small figures casting long shadows across the sun-baked earth. Lucia, always the leader despite being younger by 8 minutes, climbed onto the lowest fence rail to get a better view of the pasture. Sophia followed, more cautiously. 1, 2, 3. Their counting began in unison as they pointed at each horse. The white stallion, Marengo was his name, though Richard didn't know it, approached the fence, his ears perked forward with interest at the small visitors. Richard slid back into the driver's seat, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the key in the ignition. Through the rearview mirror, he could see the twins still counting, their backs to him, unaware that this moment would divide their lives into before and after. "They'll be better off," he whispered to himself as he put the car in reverse. Dad always wanted more children around the ranch. The Escalade rolled backward, then forward, picking up speed as it headed down the driveway. Richard didn't look back, couldn't look back. If he did, he might see what he was really doing, abandoning his flesh and blood because they had become inconvenient to the life he wanted to live. The final lie he told that day was to himself, that he would call his father later, explain the situation, work out some kind of arrangement. But as the Hacienda disappeared behind him, Richard already knew he would change his phone number tomorrow, file for a transfer to his company's Seattle office next week. Begin the process of becoming someone who had never been a father at all. Behind him, the counting stopped as two small heads turned to watch their father's car disappear in a cloud of dust. "Daddy!" Sophia's voice quavered as the dust from the driveway settled. "Daddy!" she called louder, her small hands gripping the weathered fence rail. Lucia slid down from her perch, landing with a soft thud on the sun-baked earth. "And he's coming back," she assured her sister, though doubt had already begun to creep into her voice. "He's just parking the car." Minutes passed. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on their uncovered heads. Sophia's lower lip trembled as she stared down the empty driveway. "I want to go inside. It's too hot, Lucy." "We have to wait here," Lucia insisted, though sweat now plastered her curls to her forehead. Daddy said to count the horses and wait. The white stallion with the gray speckled mane watched the small humans intently. Marengo had lived on the Martinez estate for 15 years, since Carlos had purchased him as a spirited 3-year-old from a prestigious breeding farm in Kentucky. Age had gentled him, turned his once snow-white coat into a canvas of weathered ivory, etched with the wisdom that comes from a decade and a half of observing human behavior. And in his 15 years, Marengo had never seen Carlos Martinez leave children unattended by the fence. 7 horses, Sophia counted again, her voice growing smaller. "There are 7 horses, Lucy." "When is Daddy coming back?" "Soon," Lucia answered automatically, but her eyes darted nervously toward the empty driveway. Their father had never left them alone like this before. Even with the parade of nannies that had cycled through their lives since their mother's death, Richard had always made sure someone was watching them. Marengo snorted softly, moving closer to the fence. His intelligent eyes, dark pools that had witnessed the best and worst of human nature, sensed the girl's growing distress. The older stallion's instincts, honed by years of protecting foals in his herd, stirred to life. The twins' backpacks sat forgotten in the dirt. Sophia sank down beside hers, her small shoulders beginning to shake with quiet sobs. "Don't cry," Lucia said fiercely, though her own eyes were filling with tears. "We're big girls." Daddy said we're big girls now. But they weren't big girls. They were 5-year-old children who had lost their mother 6 months ago and who were now realizing, in the innocent, devastating way that children come to understand adult betrayal, that their father wasn't coming back either. Marengo pawed at the ground, his hoof striking the earth with purpose. He tossed his head, his mane catching the sunlight. When neither child responded to his movements, he let out a short, sharp whinny. Lucia turned, startled by the sound. "Look, Sophia, the white horse is talking to us." Sophia raised her tear-streaked face. "What's he saying?" "I don't know." Lucia approached the fence cautiously. "Hi, horse." Marengo lowered his magnificent head, his muzzle extending toward the child's outstretched hand. His breath was warm against her palm. "He's friendly," Lucia declared, her momentary fear dissolving into wonder. Sophia stood up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, and joined her sister. "Can we pet him?" "I think so. He's not moving away." The stallion stood patiently as 2 small hands stroked his muzzle. For a moment, the abandoned twins forgot their growing fear, captivated by the gentle giant who seemed to understand their need for comfort. But Marengo had not forgotten their predicament. Even as he allowed the children to pet him, his ears flicked backward, listening for sounds of the ranch hands who should be alerted to the presence of these unaccompanied youngsters. Half a mile away, in the distant north barn, ranch manager Javier Rodriguez was repairing a broken stall door. At 56, Javier had worked for the Martinez family for nearly 3 decades. He'd watched Carlos's son, Richard, grow from a sullen teenager into the detached, ambitious man who had stopped visiting the Hacienda years ago. Javier wiped sweat from his brow, his weathered hands moving methodically as he replaced the hinges on the stall door. The radio beside him played softly, Waylon Jennings singing about good-hearted women and good-timing men. He hummed along absently, thinking about the fence repairs still waiting for him in the south pasture. Back at the main corral, the twins had grown thirsty. The Texas summer showed no mercy, even to abandoned children. "Our water bottles," Lucia remembered suddenly, reaching for her backpack. As she unzipped it, her fingers brushed against a sealed envelope tucked inside. Curious, she pulled it out. "Oh, what's that?" Sophia asked, momentarily distracted from her thirst. "I don't know." Lucia turned the envelope over. "It says, 'To whom it may concern' on it." Neither child could read beyond their names and a few simple words, but both recognized that this was something important, something their father had placed in their backpacks without telling them. Marengo watched as Lucia struggled with the envelope, her small fingers unable to break the seal. Frustrated, she shoved it back into her backpack and instead pulled out the water bottle. The horse's ears pricked forward as she unscrewed the cap and took a long drink before passing it to her sister. The sun continued its relentless arc across the sky. 15 minutes had stretched into 30, 30 into 45. The twins' initial confusion had transformed into the dawning realization that something was very wrong. "Maybe Grandpa is looking for us," Sophia suggested, her voice small and uncertain. "Maybe," Lucia agreed, though she had no memory of ever meeting their grandfather. "But Daddy said to wait here." Marengo had grown increasingly restless. He paced along the fence line, occasionally stopping to look at the girls before turning his gaze toward the distant barn where Javier worked. His instincts told him these foals needed help, and soon the stallion threw his head back and let out a loud, piercing neigh that echoed across the property, a sound so urgent and persistent that it cut through the ambient noise of the ranch like a siren. He reared slightly, his front hooves pawing at the air before landing with a heavy thud. Sophia clutched her sister's hand. "Is he angry?" "I don't think so," Lucia said, though she took a cautious step back from the fence. I think he's trying to tell us something. Marengo continued his vocal performance, each neigh louder and more insistent than the last. The other horses in the corral, startled by the stallion's unusual behavior, began to move nervously, adding their own whinnies to the commotion. In the north barn, Javier paused in his work, his head lifting at the distant sound of distressed horses. 15 years of working with animals had taught him to distinguish between ordinary horse communications and signs of trouble. "What the hell?" he muttered, setting down his tools. Marengo, in particular, was not known for making unnecessary noise. If the old stallion was raising an alarm, something was wrong. Javier stepped out of the barn, shielding his eyes against the sun as he looked toward the main corral. And that's when he saw them, two tiny figures standing by the fence, their matching dresses fluttering in the hot summer breeze like small flags of surrender. Javier Rodriguez walked briskly across the sun-baked earth, his weathered boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. As he drew closer to the main corral, Marengo's urgent whinnying subsided, replaced by a soft nickering, as if the horse was saying, "Finally." Someone came. The ranch manager's mind raced with questions. Who were these children? How had they gotten onto the property? The Martinez estate sat on 500 acres of private land, with the nearest neighbor almost 3 miles away. "Hello there," Javier called out, his voice deliberately gentle as he approached the fence. Two identical faces turned toward him, their expressions a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "Are you Grandpa's friend?" the one in the pink dress asked, her small voice trembling slightly. Javier's brow furrowed. "I work for Mr. Martinez. Yes, I'm Javier, the ranch manager. Who are you girls?" The one in the purple dress stood a little straighter. "I'm Lucia Martinez. This is my sister Sofia. We're waiting for our daddy to come back." Martinez. The surname hit Javier like a physical blow. These weren't just any children who had wandered onto the property. These were Carlos's granddaughters, Richard's twins. He'd heard about their birth 5 years ago, had seen pictures Carlos kept in his study, but Richard had never brought them to visit. "Your daddy left you here?" Javier asked carefully, crouching down to meet their eyes. Sofia nodded, tears welling up again. "He said to count the horses and wait, but he's been gone a long time now. He said Grandpa was expecting us," Lucia added, her brown eyes, so like Carlos's, studying Javier's face for confirmation. "Is he?" Javier felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Carlos had mentioned nothing about visitors today, especially not his estranged son and granddaughters. The old man was in town, meeting with his accountant, a monthly ritual that always took the entire afternoon. "Your grandfather will be very happy to see you," Javier said, choosing his words with care. "But he's not home right now. He's in town and will be back soon." Marengo pushed his nose through the fence rails, nudging Lucia's shoulder gently. The girl reached up automatically to stroke his muzzle. "And this horse has been keeping us company," she explained. "I think he's nice." "That's Marengo," Javier said, grateful for the momentary distraction. "He's your grandfather's favorite. He's been on this ranch longer than you've been alive." Sofia pointed to their backpacks. "Daddy left these for us. There's a letter inside." Javier's unease deepened. "A letter?" Lucia nodded, retrieving the envelope she'd struggled with earlier. "It says, 'To whom it may concern.' We can't open it." With slightly shaking hands, Javier took the envelope. He tore it open and unfolded a single sheet of expensive stationery. As he read, his weathered face darkened with anger and disbelief. "To whom it may concern, these are my daughters, Lucia and Sofia Martinez, born May 12, 2018. Their mother, Elena, passed away 6 months ago. I am no longer able to care for them." They are now the responsibility of their grandfather, Carlos Martinez. Please do not attempt to contact me. Richard Martinez. No apology. No explanation beyond his own convenience. Not even a goodbye to the daughters he was abandoning like unwanted pets. Javier folded the letter carefully, containing his rage for the sake of the two pairs of innocent eyes watching him intently. "Let's get you girls inside, out of this heat," he said, his voice strained with suppressed emotion. "You must be hungry and thirsty." "But Daddy said to wait here," Sophia protested weakly. Javier hesitated, unsure how to explain to 5-year-olds that their father had deliberately abandoned them. "Your daddy wanted me to take you to the house when I found you," he improvised. "It's part of the surprise for your grandfather." The twins exchanged glances, silently communicating in that mysterious way identical twins often do. Finally, Lucia nodded. "Okay, but can we say goodbye to Marengo first?" "Of course!" Javier watched as the girls solemnly patted the horse's nose, thanking him for keeping them company. Marengo stood perfectly still, his intelligent eyes following their movements as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Javier helped the girls gather their backpacks and led them toward the main house, a sprawling single-story structure built in the traditional Spanish colonial style that had given the region its architectural character. Inside, the thick adobe walls kept the interior cool despite the summer heat. "This is so big," Sophia whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the expansive living room with its heavy wooden furniture and colorful woven rugs. "Is this where Mommy played when she was little?" Lucia asked, remembering what their father had told them. Javier frowned slightly. "Did your daddy tell you that?" Lucia nodded. "He said Mommy used to play under the big tree by the fence." Another lie, Javier realized. Elena Martinez had grown up in Austin, the daughter of a university professor. She had never set foot on this ranch until after her marriage to Richard. "Why don't you girls sit here while I call your grandfather?" Javier suggested, gesturing to a comfortable leather sofa. "Mrs. Diaz, our housekeeper, will bring you something to eat and drink." As if on cue, a plump woman in her 60s appeared from the kitchen, her kind face creasing with surprise at the sight of the twins. "Dios mío, who are these beautiful niñas?" she exclaimed. "Carlos's granddaughters," Javier explained quietly. "I need to call him. It's urgent." While Mrs. Diaz fussed over the twins, Javier stepped into Carlos's study and closed the door. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed his employer's cell phone. Carlos Martinez answered on the third ring. "Javier, everything all right at the ranch?" "Sir, you need to come home immediately," Javier said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Your granddaughters are here." A long pause followed. "My what?" "Your son's twins, sir. Lucia and Sophia. Richard dropped them off and he left. There's a letter." "He's not coming back for them." The silence that followed was so profound that Javier momentarily wondered if the call had dropped. Then he heard Carlos exhale sharply. "He abandoned his own children at my gate." Carlos's voice was dangerously quiet. "By the main corral, sir. If Marengo hadn't raised such a fuss, I might not have found them for hours. They've been sitting in the sun, waiting for their father to return from parking the car." A string of Spanish curses followed, words Javier hadn't heard his dignified employer use in years. "I'm on my way," Carlos said finally. 15 minutes. Take care of them, Javier." "Yes, sir." When Javier returned to the living room, he found the twins perched on the sofa, each holding a glass of lemonade, while Mrs. Diaz sat between them, gently questioning them about their journey. "Your grandfather is coming home right away," Javier announced. "He's very excited to see you." "Is he nice?" Sophia asked hesitantly. The question broke Javier's heart. These children had no idea who their grandfather was, the man whose framed photograph of them sat prominently on his desk, whose eyes lit up whenever he spoke of the granddaughters he'd never been allowed to know. "He's the nicest man I know," Javier answered truthfully, "and he already loves you very much." Exactly 14 minutes later, Carlos Martinez's black Ford F-150 skidded to a stop in front of the house. The 72-year-old rancher moved with the energy of a much younger man as he burst through the front door, his silver hair disheveled, his lined face a study in barely contained emotion. He stopped short at the sight of the twins, their small faces turning toward him in perfect synchronicity. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sofia, ever the more cautious of the two, slid off the sofa and took a tentative step forward. "Are you our grandpa?" she asked, her voice small but clear in the hushed room. Carlos Martinez, who had built a cattle empire from nothing, who had faced down economic downturns and drought with stoic resolve, found himself suddenly unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He nodded, sinking slowly to one knee to meet his granddaughter at eye level. "Yes, mi corazón," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your grandpa, Carlos." Sofia stood frozen, studying the weathered face of the grandfather she'd never met. Carlos remained on one knee, his heart hammering against his ribs as he fought to contain the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Joy at finally meeting his granddaughters, rage at his son's unconscionable actions, and a deep, aching sorrow for what these children had already endured in their short lives. Lucia, watching her sister's hesitation, slipped off the sofa and moved to stand beside her. "Our daddy said you were expecting us," she said, her clear voice carrying a hint of accusation that belied her 5 years. "But Mr. Javier said you didn't know." Carlos swallowed hard. Even in this first meeting, he would not begin with a lie. "Your daddy didn't tell me you were coming," he admitted gently, "but that doesn't mean you aren't welcome." "I've been waiting to meet you for a very long time. Why didn't you visit us before?" Sofia asked, her lower lip trembling slightly. "If you wanted to meet us?" The innocent question landed like a physical blow. How could he explain the bitter estrangement, the doors Richard had slammed in his face, the birthday gifts returned unopened, the Christmas cards sent back marked refused? "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," Carlos said finally. "Your daddy and we had a disagreement, but that had nothing to do with you. I've always wanted to know you." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew his wallet. From inside, he pulled out a slightly worn photograph, 2 identical toddlers in matching red dresses, their chestnut curls framing cherubic faces split with wide grins. "I've carried your picture with me every day since you were 3 years old," he said, holding it out for them to see. "Your daddy sent it to me. It's the only one I have." The twins stared at the photograph, recognition dawning on their small faces. "That's from Christmas," Lucia said, pointing. "We got those dresses from Santa." A tender smile curved Carlos's lips. "You were the most beautiful children I'd ever seen." "Still are." Sofia, her natural caution gradually yielding to curiosity, took a tentative step closer. "Did you know our mommy?" Carlos nodded, emotion tightening his throat again. "I met your mother several times. She was kind and beautiful, just like you two." "She went to heaven," Lucia stated matter-of-factly, though her eyes clouded with sadness. "Daddy said she's an angel now." "I believe that's true," Carlos agreed softly. He held out his hands, one toward each girl, offering but not demanding. "Would it be all right if I gave you a hug? I've been waiting 5 years for that." The twins exchanged another of their silent consultations. Then, moving in perfect synchronicity, They stepped forward into their grandfather's embrace. Carlos enfolded them gently, his large hands trembling slightly as they patted the small backs. He closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the scent of their hair, strawberry shampoo, and the distinctive smell of children who have played in the sun. When he released them, he was surprised to find moisture on his cheeks. He wiped it away quickly, but not before Lucia noticed. "Are you sad, Grandpa?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "No, mi corazón," Carlos assured her. "Sometimes people cry when they're very happy." "And meeting you two makes me very, very happy." Javier, who had been standing quietly by the door, cleared his throat. "Sir, perhaps the girls would like to see their room. Mrs. Diaz prepared the blue bedroom while you were on your way." Carlos nodded gratefully. "Would you like to see where you'll be staying?" he asked the twins. A cloud passed over Sophia's face. "For how long?" she asked quietly. "Until Daddy comes back." The question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Javier and Mrs. Diaz exchanged concerned glances. Carlos felt a fresh surge of anger toward his son, but he kept his voice gentle. "You're going to stay here with me, mijas. This is your home now." Lucia's eyes narrowed slightly. "But what about our house, our toys?" "School starts next month." Carlos straightened, his knees protesting the movement after so long crouched at child height. "We'll figure all that out together. Right now, let's get you settled in. Then maybe you'd like to meet the horses properly. Marengo seems to have taken a liking to you already." "The white horse?" Sophia's expression brightened. "He was nice to us." "He's very special," Carlos agreed, "and very smart. He's the one who made sure Javier found you." While Mrs. Diaz led the twins down the hallway to show them their room, Carlos turned to Javier, his face hardening. "Show me the letter," he demanded, his voice low to ensure the girls wouldn't hear. Javier handed over the single sheet of paper. Carlos read it once, twice, his weathered hands tightening around the expensive stationery until it crumpled at the edges. "Bastard," he whispered, the word filled with a lifetime of disappointment. "My own son!" "What will you do, sir?" Javier asked quietly. Carlos stared out the window toward the driveway where Richard's car had disappeared. "Call my lawyer. Those girls need stability, legal protection. I won't have Richard changing his mind in 6 months when it's convenient for him." "And the girls' belongings?" "Their documents. Everything they own is in those backpacks," Carlos said bitterly. "Birth certificates, probably, nothing else." Richard wanted a clean break. Javier shook his head in disbelief. How could anyone do that to their own children? "My son stopped being the man I raised a long time ago," Carlos replied, his voice heavy with old grief. "But those little girls," his expression softened, "they're Martinez's. They belong here. This land will be theirs someday." Mrs. Diaz reappeared in the doorway, her kind face creased with concern. "The little one, Sophia, is asking when her daddy's coming back. I didn't know what to tell her." Carlos sighed deeply. "I'll talk to them. They deserve the truth, or as much of it as they can understand at their age." He found the twins sitting side by side on a queen-sized bed covered with a handmade quilt in shades of blue and white. The room, originally intended for guests, had hastily been made child-friendly with the addition of a small nightlight and a few stuffed animals Mrs. Diaz had unearthed from storage. Lucia was unpacking her backpack methodically, laying out its meager contents on the bed, a change of clothes, a small stuffed rabbit missing one ear, a toothbrush in a plastic case. Sophia sat with her backpack clutched to her chest, watching her sister but making no move to unpack her own things. "It's very pretty," Lucia commented as Carlos entered. "But it's only one bed. Do we have to share?" "We can arrange for another bed," Carlos assured her, "or separate rooms if you prefer." Sophia shook her head quickly. "We want to stay together," she insisted, speaking for both of them. Then together you'll stay," Carlos agreed, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Girls, I need to talk to you about something important. It might be hard to understand." Lucia stopped her unpacking, her small face suddenly serious. Sophia clutched her backpack tighter, as if preparing herself for bad news. "Your daddy," Carlos began, then paused, searching for words that would be honest without being cruel. Your daddy thought you would be happier living here with me, on the ranch." "For how long?" Lucia pressed, always the direct one. Carlos met her gaze steadily. "For a long time, mija, maybe forever." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "But why doesn't he want us anymore? Did we do something bad?" "No," Carlos said firmly, moving to kneel in front of her. "Nothing bad at all. Sometimes adults make very wrong decisions, but it's never a child's fault, never." "He was different after Mommy died," Lucia observed, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her years. "He didn't laugh anymore. He didn't read us stories." Carlos felt his heart breaking for these children who had already lost so much. "I know this is confusing and sad," he said gently, "but I want you to know something very important. I want you here. I'm so happy you've come to live with me, and I promise I will never, ever leave you." Sophia's tears spilled over. "But you're old," she said, her childish bluntness momentarily startling Carlos. "What if you go to heaven like Mommy?" Carlos couldn't help the small chuckle that escaped him. "I may have gray hair, mija, but I'm very healthy. I plan to be around to see you grow into beautiful young women. Can we see the horses now?" Lucia asked suddenly, clearly seeking distraction from the heavy conversation. Carlos recognized the deflection, but decided not to press. There would be time, years, God willing, to help the twins process their father's abandonment. Today, they needed comfort and distraction. "Of course," he agreed, standing and offering his hands to them once more. "But let's go thank Marengo properly for looking after you." As they walked back through the house toward the door, Carlos felt Sophia's small hand slip into his. He squeezed it gently, making a silent vow to these children who had been so carelessly discarded by his own son. They would know love here, they would know stability, and someday they would know that being left behind at the Martinez estate was not the end of their story, but the beginning. The afternoon sun had gentled by the time Carlos led his granddaughters back to the corral. The harsh, white light of midday had mellowed to a golden glow that bathed the Martinez estate in honey-colored warmth. Marengo stood at the fence, almost as if he'd been waiting for their return, his intelligent eyes following the small procession. "He remembers us," Lucia whispered, tugging at Carlos's hand excitedly. "Oh, horses have excellent memories," Carlos confirmed, "especially Marengo. He's the smartest horse I've ever owned." Sophia approached the fence cautiously, her earlier enthusiasm tempered by the emotional conversation in the bedroom. "Can we pet him again?" "Even better," Carlos replied. "Would you like to meet him properly, inside the corral?" The twins' eyes widened simultaneously. Is it safe?" Lucia asked, though her voice held eagerness rather than fear. Carlos nodded. "Marengo is very gentle with children, and I'll be right beside you the whole time." He unlatched the gate and led the girls inside the corral, keeping a protective hand on each of their shoulders. Marengo remained where he was, watching their approach with ears pricked forward, a sign, Carlos knew, of friendly interest. "Let him smell your hand first," Carlos instructed, demonstrating by extending his own palm toward the horse's muzzle. "This is how horses say hello." The twins mimicked his gesture, giggling when Marengo's soft muzzle tickled their palms. "Why is his hair gray here but white everywhere else?" Sophia asked, pointing to the stallion's mane. "That's how we know he's wise," Carlos explained with a smile. "Just like my grey hair shows I've lived a long time and learned many things." "Did you have him when you were little?" Lucia inquired, boldly stroking Marengo's neck now. Carlos chuckled. "No, mija. I got Marengo 15 years ago. But that was still a long time before you were born. He was young and spirited back then. We've grown older together." Marengo whickered softly, as if agreeing with this assessment. "What does that mean?" Sophia asked. "When he makes that noise, that's his way of talking," Carlos explained. "Horses communicate with sounds and body language. That particular sound means he's content, happy to be with friends." Lucia looked thoughtful. "Is that why he made the loud noise earlier, when we were waiting for Daddy? Was he trying to talk to Mr. Javier?" Carlos exchanged a glance with Javier, who had accompanied them to the corral and now leaned against the fence, watching the interaction with a small smile. "That's exactly right," Carlos confirmed. "Marengo knew you needed help, so he called until someone came." "He's a hero horse," Sophia declared, her face lighting up with the first genuine smile Carlos had seen from her. "That he is," Carlos agreed, his weathered hand joining his granddaughter's, smaller ones in stroking the stallion's gleaming neck. "Without Marengo, Mr. Javier might not have found you for a long time." The significance of this wasn't lost on the girls, young as they were. Lucia wrapped her arms around Marengo's sturdy leg in a spontaneous hug. "Thank you for helping us," she said solemnly. Carlos felt his throat tighten as he watched Sophia follow her sister's example, the two small figures embracing the legs of the massive horse who stood perfectly still, seemingly understanding the importance of the moment. "Would you like to give him a treat?" Carlos asked after a moment, pulling a few sugar cubes from his pocket. "He's earned it today." The twins nodded eagerly, and Carlos showed them how to hold their palms flat with the sugar cubes in the center. Marengo delicately took the offered treats, his whiskers tickling their hands and making them giggle again. "Can we ride him?" Lucia asked hopefully. "Not today," Carlos replied, "but soon, if you'd like to learn. We have gentle ponies for beginners, but eventually you could learn to ride Marengo." "Promise?" Sophia pressed, her earlier reticence melting away in the face of this exciting prospect. "Promise," Carlos said, sealing the first of many commitments he would make to these children. As the sun began to sink lower on the horizon, painting the Texas sky in dramatic strokes of orange and pink, Carlos reluctantly suggested they head back to the house for dinner. The twins said goodbye to Marengo with solemn ceremony, extracting a promise from their grandfather that they could return first thing in the morning. That night, after Mrs. Diaz had served a dinner of chicken enchiladas that the girls approached with curious hesitation before declaring them even better than pizza. Carlos sat in the living room making phone calls while the twins explored their new surroundings under Mrs. Diaz's watchful eye. His first call was to his attorney, Margaret Wilson, a formidable woman who had handled the Martinez family's legal affairs for 2 decades. "And I need emergency guardianship papers drawn up," Carlos explained after describing the situation. "And then I want to file for permanent legal custody." "Has Richard legally relinquished his parental rights?" Margaret asked, her tone professional despite the shock evident in her voice. "He left a letter," Carlos replied grimly. "It's not a legal document, but it clearly states his intention to abandon his responsibilities. He's made no attempt to contact me since leaving them here. That's not enough for termination of parental rights," Margaret warned, "but it's sufficient for temporary emergency guardianship. I'll have those papers ready for your signature tomorrow. The rest, we'll take it one step at a time." His next call was to Dr. Sarah Reynolds, the family physician who had treated 3 generations of Martinez's. The girls will need checkups, he said. And possibly psychological support. Their mother died 6 months ago, and now this. Bring them in tomorrow afternoon, Dr. Reynolds replied without hesitation. I'll clear my schedule. And Carlos, you're doing the right thing. His final call of the evening was to Elizabeth Thornton, the principal of Cielo County Elementary School. Though it was well after hours, Elizabeth answered promptly, one of the benefits of small-town living. We'll need to enroll the girls for kindergarten this fall, Carlos explained. They're 5, turning 6 in May. Twins? Elizabeth asked. Her interest piqued. We haven't had twins at Cielo Elementary in years. Bring their records when you can. But don't worry if there's a delay. We'll make sure they're welcomed properly. By the time Carlos finished his calls, the twins had been bathed, with much splashing and giggling, according to Mrs. Diaz, and dressed in the single set of pajamas Richard had included in their backpacks. They sat side by side on the blue quilted bed, their damp hair combed neatly, their small faces solemn once more as the day's events caught up with them. Time for sleep, mijas, Carlos said gently from the doorway. Tomorrow will be a busy day. Will Marengo miss us tonight? Sophia asked, her voice already thick with approaching sleep. I'm sure he will, Carlos assured her, but he knows you'll be back tomorrow. Grandpa? Lucia said, as Carlos bent to kiss her forehead. Are you sure Daddy isn't coming back for us? The question, delivered in a small, uncertain voice, pierced Carlos's heart like a physical pain. I'm sure that no matter what happens, he replied carefully, this is your home now. And I will always be here for you. It wasn't until the twins were sound asleep, their identical faces peaceful in repose, that Carlos Martinez allowed his composure to crack. Sitting alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, he finally gave in to the rage and sorrow that had been building since Javier's phone call that afternoon. Silent tears tracked down his weathered cheeks as he mourned, not for the son he had lost years ago, but for the granddaughters who had paid the price for Richard's selfishness. The examination room at Dr. Sarah Reynolds' practice was decorated with cheerful murals of cartoon animals in Western attire, a concession to her many young patients in this ranching community. Sophia sat on the examination table, her legs dangling over the edge, while Lucia explored the small basket of toys in the corner. Carlos stood nearby, his weathered hat in his hands, watching his granddaughters with a mixture of concern and pride. 2 days had passed since Richard's abandonment of the twins. 2 days of Carlos navigating the uncharted territory of raising 2 5-year-old girls who alternated between moments of surprising resilience and heartbreaking vulnerability. Their physical health is excellent, Dr. Reynolds said quietly, reviewing her notes while Sophia slid off the table to join her sister with the toys. And they're in the 60th percentile for height and weight, perfectly normal for their age. And the other concerns? Carlos asked, his voice low enough that the twins couldn't hear. Sarah Reynolds had been the Martinez family physician for over 20 years. She had treated Richard's broken arm when he fell from a horse at 12, had diagnosed Carlos's hypertension 5 years ago, and had attended Elena's funeral 6 months earlier, offering quiet support to the grieving widower who had seemed more irritated than devastated by his loss. Emotionally, they're showing remarkable resilience, she said carefully, but there are signs of anxiety, particularly in Sophia. She asked me 3 times if you were coming back while you stepped out to sign those forms. Carlos's jaw tightened. Richard has damaged their ability to trust. It's not irreparable, Sarah assured him. Children are remarkably adaptive. But I would recommend they speak with Dr. Lillian Parker. She's a child psychologist who specializes in trauma and grief. the combination of losing their mother and now being abandoned by their father. They'll need professional support to process that healthily. Carlos nodded, watching as the twins built a small tower with wooden blocks, their heads bent together in concentration. I'll make an appointment, whatever they need. And how are you holding up? Sarah asked, her professional demeanor softening with genuine concern. Carlos gave a tired smile. I'm 72 years old, Sarah. I thought my child-rearing days were long behind me. Now I have 2 5-year-olds who need everything. You're not alone, she reminded him. This whole community will help. These girls are Martinez's. Cielo County takes care of its own. Later that afternoon, as Carlos drove back to the ranch with the twins, safely buckled in the back seat of his truck, Lucia broke the comfortable silence that had fallen. Grandpa, when can we go home to get our toys? The question, delivered with a child's innocent directness, caused Carlos's hands to tighten momentarily on the steering wheel. He had been dreading this inevitable request. We're going to get you new toys, mijas, he replied carefully, meeting Lucia's eyes in the rearview mirror. Even better ones. But I want my purple unicorn, Sophia protested. And my books. Daddy said we were just visiting you. He didn't say to pack everything. Because he never intended for you to return, Carlos thought bitterly. Aloud, he said, I'll see what I can do about getting your things. For now, why don't we stop at Wilson's General Store and pick out some new books and toys? Would you like that? The enthusiastic response from the back seat provided a temporary distraction. But Carlos knew this issue would resurface. The girls' belongings represented their previous life, a life Richard had severed with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. After a whirlwind shopping trip that left the twins clutching new stuffed animals, a unicorn for Sophia, a dragon for Lucia, and a bag full of books, they returned to the ranch just as Javier was finishing his afternoon chores. Marengo's been waiting for you, he told the girls with a wink. Hasn't eaten his afternoon oats yet. I think he was saving them until you arrived. The twins looked to Carlos for permission, their identical faces alight with excitement. Go ahead, he nodded. I'll be there in a minute. As the girls raced toward the corral, Carlos turned to Javier. Any word? Javier's expression darkened. I drove by the house in Austin like you asked. It's empty, Carlos. For sale sign in the yard. Neighbor said Richard cleared everything out yesterday, had a moving company there at dawn. Carlos swore softly, running a hand through his silver hair. He's erasing them from his life completely. There's more, Javier continued reluctantly. I made some calls. Richard closed his real estate office in Austin last week, transferred all his clients to a partner. Word is he's moved to Seattle, accepted a position with a major development firm there. The confirmation of Richard's premeditation hit Carlos like a physical blow. His son hadn't abandoned the twins in a moment of desperation or weakness. He had planned it methodically, arranging his escape weeks in advance. He won't get away with this, Carlos said, his voice hard with determination. Those girls deserve better. Speaking of which, Javier nodded toward the corral, where Lucia and Sophia were now feeding Marengo handfuls of oats, giggling as his soft muzzle tickled their palms. They seemed to be settling in. Marengo's adopted them completely. Haven't seen him this attentive since that orphaned foal 3 years back. Carlos watched the scene with a softening expression. Animals know things we don't, Javier. Marengo recognized something in those girls from the moment they arrived, something worth protecting. Like grandfather, like horse, Javier observed with a small smile. That evening, after the twins had been bathed and tucked into bed with their new stuffed animals, and a story about a brave horse who saved a lost princess, Carlos sat in his study with Margaret Wilson, his attorney. And the emergency guardianship has been granted, Margaret informed him, sliding the official documents across his desk. As the children's biological grandfather, and with evidence of abandonment, the judge had no reservations. But permanent custody will be more complex. Because of Richard, Carlos stated flatly. Margaret nodded. Legally, abandonment isn't established until a parent has had no contact for 6 months. Richard could return tomorrow and legally reclaim the children. He won't, Carlos said with certainty. He's moved to Seattle, sold their house, transferred his business. He's not coming back. Even so, the law requires due process. We've filed the petition for permanent guardianship, but Richard will be served notice and given an opportunity to respond. Carlos leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. And if he ignores it, if he wants nothing to do with this proceeding, just as he wants nothing to do with his daughters, then after the waiting period, the court will likely grant your petition, Margaret assured him, especially given the circumstances and your relationship to the children. And if by some miracle Richard develops a conscience and contests it. Margaret's expression became grave. Then we fight. But Carlos, you should be prepared for a long and potentially painful process. Custody battles are never easy, especially when they involve allegations of abandonment against a parent who may suddenly decide he wants to be a father again. Carlos gazed at the framed photograph on his desk, the one of the twins at age 3 that he'd carried in his wallet until today, when he'd finally had a proper frame for it. Whatever it takes, Margaret, he said softly. Those girls have lost enough. I won't let them be hurt again. 3 months passed, bringing the crisp clarity of autumn to the Martinez estate. September had seen the twins start kindergarten at Cielo County Elementary, where they quickly became beloved fixtures, identical faces with increasingly different personalities emerging. October had painted the ranch in golden hues as Carlos established routines that provided the stability the girls desperately needed. Now, as November settled over the hacienda with cool mornings and the promise of Thanksgiving approaching, Carlos marveled at the transformation of his life and home. The Martinez estate, once a place of solitary contemplation for a widower entering his twilight years, now echoed with childish laughter and the constant patter of small feet. The blue bedroom had been transformed into a proper children's room, with twin beds sporting colorful quilts handmade by Mrs. Diaz, walls decorated with the girls' artwork, and bookshelves overflowing with stories of horses, princesses, and brave adventurers. On this particular Saturday morning, Carlos sat on the porch with his coffee, watching as Javier gave the twins their weekly riding lesson. Sophia sat proudly atop a gentle pinto pony named Sprinkles, while Lucia, always more daring, had graduated to a slightly larger bay named Copper. Marengo observed from nearby, his role as self-appointed guardian never wavering, despite the girls' growing comfort with the other horses. "Look, Grandpa," Lucia called, steering Copper in a perfect circle around the training ring. "I'm doing it by myself." "Excellent, mija," Carlos called back, his heart swelling with pride. "You're a natural vaquera." Sophia, not to be outdone, urged Sprinkles into a walk, her small face a mask of concentration as she remembered Javier's instructions about posture and rein control. "They've come so far," Mrs. Diaz remarked, appearing at Carlos's side with a fresh pot of coffee. 3 months ago, they were frightened little birds. Now look at them. Carlos nodded, accepting a refill. "Dr. Parker says their progress is remarkable, but not surprising. Children are resilient when they have stability and love." The weekly sessions with Dr. Lillian Parker, the child psychologist, had become another fixture in their new life. At first, The twins had been reluctant to speak about their feelings, but the gentle therapist had skillfully drawn them out through play and art therapy. Their drawings had evolved from dark, confused scribbles to increasingly colorful depictions of ranch life, always featuring Marengo prominently, often larger than any other figure in their artwork. "Any word from the courts?" Mrs. Diaz asked quietly, her eyes still on the twins as they completed their riding exercises. Carlos's expression tightened momentarily. "Richard was served the custody papers 6 weeks ago. He has until next Friday to respond before the court proceeds without his input. And you think he will ignore them?" "That's what Margaret believes," Carlos confirmed, referring to his attorney. "He's built a new life in Seattle. A clean slate." The phone call from Margaret the previous evening had been cautiously optimistic. Richard had made no attempt to contact his daughters since abandoning them. No phone calls, no letters, not even a request for information about their welfare. His systematic erasure of his paternal responsibilities strengthened Carlos's case for permanent custody. "The girls asked about him yesterday," Mrs. Diaz said hesitantly. "Sophia wanted to know if he would come for Christmas." Carlos sighed heavily. Despite their evident happiness at the ranch, despite the therapeutic progress they'd made, the twins still occasionally asked about their father. It was natural, Dr. Parker had assured him, and even healthy, part of their process of understanding and eventually accepting what had happened. "What did you tell them?" he asked. That Christmas was still a long way off, but that they would be celebrating here with their new family, Mrs. Diaz replied. Lucia seemed satisfied with that. Sophia just nodded. In the riding ring, Javier was now helping the girls dismount, praising their progress lavishly. Marengo approached as soon as the twins' feet touched the ground, nudging their shoulders gently as if offering his own congratulations. "Grandpa, did you see?" Sophia called, running toward the porch with more animation than she typically displayed. "I didn't even need Javier to hold the reins this time." "I saw Querida," Carlos assured her, setting down his coffee cup to receive her enthusiastic hug. "You're becoming quite the horsewoman." "Marengo thinks so too," Lucia declared, following her sister at a more measured pace. "Oh, he told me," Carlos raised an eyebrow, playing along with what had become a familiar refrain. "Oh, and what exactly did he say?" "He said we're getting good enough that soon we can ride him," Lucia stated confidently. "Right, Marengo." The old stallion, who had followed the twins to the porch, nickered softly, tossing his graying mane. "See," Lucia said triumphantly. "He agrees." Carlos chuckled, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Gee, well, if Marengo says so, who am I to argue? But not until Javier says you're ready." The morning proceeded with the comfortable rhythm that had become their weekend routine. After riding lessons came chores, simple tasks appropriate for the twins, age that Carlos insisted upon to teach responsibility. Sophia and Lucia helped gather eggs from the chicken coop, giggling as the hens clucked indignantly at the intrusion. They assisted Mrs. Diaz in watering the kitchen garden, taking turns with the watering can that was almost too heavy for their small arms to manage. After lunch, while the twins napped, a routine they were beginning to outgrow but that Carlos maintained for the precious moments of quiet it provided, the old rancher found himself drawn to the corral where Marengo stood in the shade of a large oak tree. "You've changed their lives, old friend," Carlos said softly, stroking the horse's gleaming neck. "That first day, if you hadn't raised the alarm..." He didn't finish the thought. The possibility of what might have happened to two 5-year-olds left alone for hours in the Texas heat was too painful to contemplate. Marengo nudged Carlos's shoulder gently, almost as if responding to the unspoken gratitude. They've changed my life too, Carlos continued, speaking to the horse as he often did when they were alone. I thought my purpose now was just to maintain the ranch until, he paused, until I wasn't here anymore. But they've given me a reason to look forward, to plan for a future I won't even see. The sound of a vehicle approaching drew Carlos's attention. A sleek black sedan was making its way up the driveway, Margaret Wilson's car. She wasn't expected until Monday for their weekly update meeting. A knot of apprehension formed in Carlos's stomach as he patted Marengo once more before heading to meet his attorney. Unexpected visits rarely brought good news. Margaret's expression as she stepped from the car confirmed his fears. Her usually composed features were tight with concern, her movements brisk as she retrieved her briefcase. "What's happened?" Carlos asked without preamble as they met halfway between the house and the corral. "Richard responded to the petition," Margaret said grimly. "He's contesting the permanent custody arrangement." Carlos felt as if he'd been struck. "What? After 3 months of complete silence?" Margaret nodded, her displeasure evident. "His attorney filed the response late yesterday. Richard is claiming he never intended to permanently abandon the children, that he left them with you temporarily while he established himself in a new position that could better provide for their futures." "That's a lie," Carlos said flatly. "You've seen the letter. There was nothing temporary about his intentions." "I know," Margaret agreed, her voice softening slightly. "But his attorney is good, Carlos." Veronica Hargrove from Seattle. She specializes in high-conflict custody cases. They're claiming the letter was written under extreme emotional duress following Elena's death, and that Richard has since stabilized his situation and is now prepared to resume his parental responsibilities. Carlos's weathered hands clenched into fists. "And the fact that he hasn't made a single attempt to contact the girls in 3 months? They're spinning that too," Margaret replied, her professional demeanor slipping to reveal genuine anger, claiming he was giving them time to adjust to your home before disrupting their routine. "He's lying," Carlos repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "He never wanted them." "Something's changed." Margaret hesitated before responding, her expression confirming that she'd arrived at the same conclusion Carlos was approaching. "The Martinez estate," Carlos said, the realization dawning fully. 500 acres of prime Texas ranch land, plus the investments, the mineral rights, all of it will eventually go to the twins. Margaret nodded grimly. "The petition publicly established that Lucia and Sophia are your sole heirs. The estate is worth millions," Carlos finished. "And now suddenly Richard is interested in being a father again." From the direction of the house came the sound of a door opening. The twins, awake from their nap, their voices carrying on the crisp November air as they called for their grandfather. Carlos closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself. "What do we do?" "We fight," Margaret said simply. "The hearing is set for January 15th. That gives us 2 months to build our case. And in the meantime," Margaret's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "In the meantime, the temporary guardianship remains in effect. The girls stay with you. But Carlos, Richard has requested visitation rights while the case is pending. The judge is likely to grant them." Carlos felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The twins, finally beginning to heal, finally establishing a sense of security, would once again have their world upended by the father who had discarded them when they became inconvenient. "Grandpa," Sophia's voice called again, closer now. "We're going to give Marengo an apple. Come watch." Carlos straightened his shoulders, forcing his expression to neutralize. The girls couldn't see his distress, couldn't know yet about the battle looming on the horizon. "Coming, mija," he called back, his voice betraying none of the turmoil within. As he turned toward the house, Carlos caught sight of Marengo watching from the corral. The old stallion's ears pricked forward, as if sensing the new threat to the small humans he had appointed himself to protect. "We won't let him take them," Carlos said quietly to Margaret. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, those girls belong here now." The first weekend in December brought an unseasonable chill to Cielo County. A rare Texas frost had transformed the Martinez estate overnight, coating the fence posts and dormant pastures with a delicate silver sheen. Under normal circumstances, the twins would have been delighted by this winter wonderland, pressing their small faces against the windows and begging to go outside to experience the novelty of ice crunching beneath their boots. But this Saturday morning, Lucia and Sophia sat unnaturally quiet at the breakfast table, picking at Mrs. Diaz's cinnamon pancakes without their usual enthusiasm. Their matching red sweaters, purchased by Carlos for the occasion, seemed too bright against their solemn expressions. "Remember what we talked about?" Carlos said gently, his own breakfast untouched as he watched his granddaughters with concern. "This is just a visit, a few hours, then your dad will leave, and everything goes back to normal." Sophia nodded without looking up from her plate. "Doctor, Parker said we might feel confused or scared, and that's okay. And that we should tell you or Mrs. Diaz if we feel bad," Lucia added, her voice unusually subdued. Carlos reached across the table to squeeze their small hands. "That's right, mijas. Your feelings are important, whatever they are." The court-ordered visitation, the first since Richard's abandonment 3 months earlier, had been scheduled after extensive negotiation between the attorneys. Richard would spend 4 hours with the twins at the ranch, supervised by a court-appointed observer named Miss Jenkins. Carlos had insisted the visit take place at the Hacienda rather than at a neutral location, arguing successfully that removing the girls from their secure environment would cause unnecessary distress. "Will Daddy take us away?" Sophia asked suddenly, voicing the fear that had obviously been troubling her. "Ando no, querida," Carlos assured her firmly. "He's just visiting. You're staying right here with me." "But what if he tries?" Lucia pressed, always the more direct of the two. Carlos met her worried gaze steadily. "That won't happen. Miss Jenkins will be here the whole time to make sure everything is proper, and I'll be nearby in my study if you need me." The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of visitors. The twins immediately stiffened, their identical expressions a mixture of anxiety and something else, a wariness that no 6-year-old should have to feel about seeing their parent. "It's going to be all right," Carlos promised, rising from his chair. "Remember, Marengo is watching too." This last comment, referencing their special guardian, coaxed the slightest of smiles from Sophia. Over the past months, the twins had developed an elaborate belief system around Marengo's protective abilities, insisting that the old stallion could sense when they were upset or in danger, even from a distance. Carlos moved to the window, observing as a sleek rental car parked beside the court observer's more modest vehicle. Richard emerged first, immaculately dressed in expensive casual wear that seemed calculated to project successful fatherhood. His hair was styled differently than Carlos remembered, his posture more deliberate as he surveyed the ranch with an appraising eye that made Carlos's jaw clench. Ms. Jenkins, a stern-looking woman in her 50s with a clipboard and sensible shoes, approached Richard with a professional nod. They conversed briefly before walking toward the house. Carlos turned to the twins, who had abandoned all pretense of eating. "Ready?" They nodded in unison, sliding from their chairs to stand on either side of their grandfather, small hands finding his with the instinctive trust that had developed over their months together. The knock, when it came, seemed to echo through the house. Mrs. Diaz appeared from the kitchen, her expression carefully neutral as she moved to answer the door. "Mr. Martinez," Miss Jenkins greeted formally, entering first. "And I'm Leslie Jenkins, the court-appointed visitation supervisor. We spoke on the phone." Carlos nodded, his focus already shifting to the man who followed her into the room. Father and son locked eyes for the first time in nearly 4 years, decades of complicated history and fresh betrayal hanging in the air between them. "Richard," Carlos acknowledged coolly. "Dad," Richard replied with equal frost, before his gaze dropped to the twins. His expression immediately transformed into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "There are my beautiful girls. Don't I get a hug?" The twins remained motionless, pressing closer to Carlos's sides. Ms. Jenkins cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should all sit down and ease into things. This is a significant transition for the children after several months." Richard's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Of course. Whatever makes them comfortable." They moved to the living room, where Mrs. Diaz had arranged refreshments on the coffee table. The twins chose to sit together on a small love seat, while Richard took an armchair across from them. Ms. Jenkins positioned herself where she could observe all interactions, her clipboard ready. "I've missed you both so much," Richard began, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. "I think about you every day." Lucia, always the more forthright twin, tilted her head slightly. "Then why didn't you call us?" The directness of the question seemed to catch Richard off guard. He glanced briefly at Mrs. Jenkins before responding. "I wanted to give you time to settle in here with Grandpa," he said smoothly. "Moving is hard, and I knew you needed time to adjust." "We didn't move," Sophia corrected quietly. "You left us." The simple statement, delivered in a child's matter-of-fact tone, landed like a physical blow. Richard's expression tightened momentarily before he regained his composure. "That's not exactly what happened, sweetheart. I had to go set up our new home in Seattle. It's beautiful there. You're going to love it. There's a park right across from our apartment, and the school has a wonderful art program. I know how much you both love to draw." Carlos, who had promised to leave once the visit began, found himself unable to move. The casual way Richard spoke about taking the twins to Seattle, as if it were a foregone conclusion, made his blood boil. Miss Jenkins seemed to sense his tension. "Mr. Martinez," she said gently but firmly, "we agreed you would allow the children time alone with their father." With supreme effort, Carlos nodded. "And her girls, I'll be in my study if you need anything. Mrs. Diaz is in the kitchen." "Can we go see Marengo after?" Lucia asked, a note of desperation in her voice, as if already seeking escape from this uncomfortable reunion. "Of course, mija," Carlos assured her, then forced himself to walk out of the room, every paternal instinct screaming at him to stay and protect them from the man who had so carelessly discarded them. In his study, Carlos left the door ajar, unable to completely disconnect from what was happening in the living room. He could hear Richard's voice, animated now as he told the twins about Seattle and the wonderful life they would have there once the legal misunderstanding was resolved. "Misunderstanding," Lucia's voice carried clearly. "What does that mean?" "Just grown-up business," Richard replied dismissively. "The important thing is that soon we'll be together again, as a family." Carlos's hands clenched into fists. The audacity of Richard to present himself as a devoted father, wrongfully separated from his children, when he had been the one to drive away without a backward glance, was almost unbearable. The minutes crawled by. From his vantage point, Carlos could see through the window to where Marengo stood at the fence nearest the house, as if the horse somehow knew the twins were under stress. The stallion's attention remained fixed on the building, his usual grazing abandoned in favor of this silent vigil, After nearly an hour, the sound of small, running feet in the hallway alerted Carlos. Sophia appeared in the doorway of his study, her cheeks flushed and her eyes brimming with tears. "Grandpa," she whispered urgently, "Daddy says we're going to Seattle for Christmas. He says we have to pack our things." Carlos rose immediately, his heart pounding. "Where is Mrs. Jenkins?" "Talking to Lucia. Daddy showed us pictures of our new room." Sophia's lower lip trembled. "I don't want a new room. I want our room here with the blue quilts." Carlos crouched down to her level, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. "Sophia, listen to me carefully. You are not going to Seattle for Christmas. Your father is not allowed to take you anywhere. Do you understand?" The relief on her small face was immediate and profound. "Promise." "I promise," Carlos said firmly before taking her hand and walking back to the living room. Richard was showing Lucia photographs on his phone, while Mrs. Jenkins observed with a professionally neutral expression. The atmosphere in the room had shifted palpably. Richard more animated, leaning forward eagerly, while Lucia sat with uncharacteristic stillness, her expression carefully blank in the way Carlos had come to recognize as her attempt to hide distress. "Ah, there you are, Sophia," Richard said brightly as they entered. "And I was just showing Lucia pictures of the Christmas tree we're going to decorate together in Seattle. The building has a special lighting ceremony on the 23rd. "Mr. Martinez," Carlos interrupted, addressing his son directly, "may I speak with you privately for a moment?" Richard's smile remained fixed, though his eyes hardened. "We're in the middle of something here, Dad." "It's important," Carlos insisted, then turned to Mrs. Jenkins. Would you mind staying with the girls for a few minutes?" The supervisor hesitated, clearly sensing the tension. "The visitation guidelines specify—" "5 minutes," Carlos said. "In the kitchen, you can observe from the doorway." Richard sighed dramatically but stood. "I'll be right back, girls. Then we can talk more about the skiing lessons I've arranged for after New Year's." In the kitchen, with Ms. Jenkins positioned where she could see but not easily overhear, Carlos kept his voice low but intense. "What the hell do you think you're doing? You have no right to make promises about taking them anywhere." Richard matched his father's tone, his casual mask slipping. "They're my daughters. I have every right." "You abandoned them," Carlos hissed. "Left them like unwanted pets with a note saying not to contact you. Now suddenly you're planning Christmas in Seattle. The court hasn't ruled yet, Richard." "It will," Richard replied with cold confidence. "I'm their father. The law favors biological parents. Your temporary guardianship was just that, temporary." "This isn't about being a father," Carlos said, the truth crystallizing as he spoke. "This is about the inheritance, isn't it? You found out the girls are my heirs." Something flashed in Richard's eyes, a calculation, a confirmation that Carlos had hit upon the truth. "That's absurd," Richard scoffed. "I miss my daughters. 3 months away from them has shown me what's truly important. 3 months during which you never once called, never once asked how they were doing," Carlos countered. "You didn't even send a birthday card in May." Richard's expression hardened. "And I don't need to justify myself to you. The judge will see that a father belongs with his children, especially when the alternative is a 72-year-old man who could drop dead any day." The casual cruelty of the statement momentarily robbed Carlos of speech. Before he could recover, Miss Jenkins cleared her throat from the doorway. "Gentlemen, this isn't constructive for anyone. Mr. Martinez, Richard, the girls are asking for you." The remainder of the visit proceeded with strained politeness. Richard continued to make thinly veiled references to future plans with the twins, while Carlos sat in his study, door open, listening to every word and silently fuming. When the court-mandated 4 hours finally concluded, Richard made a show of emotional farewells, promising the twins he would see them again soon. Ms. Jenkins made notes on her clipboard, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment of the interaction. As soon as Richard's rental car disappeared down the driveway, the twins ran to Carlos, their small bodies vibrating with tension finally released. "We don't have to go, right, Grandpa?" Lucia demanded, her usual confidence replaced by genuine fear. "Daddy said we'd live in Seattle after Christmas." "No, mijas," Carlos assured them, gathering them close. "The judge hasn't decided anything yet, and I promise you, I will do everything to make sure you stay right here where you belong." Sophia buried her face against his shoulder. "Marengo wouldn't let Daddy take us," she murmured with the absolute conviction of a child. He'd stop the car. Despite the gravity of the situation, Carlos felt a smile tug at his lips. "Marengo would certainly try," he agreed. "But let's hope it doesn't come to that. Now, why don't you go see him?" "I think he's been waiting for you all morning." As the twins raced toward the corral, their momentary distress already yielding to the comfort of routine and the promise of their equine guardian's company, Carlos watched from the porch with a heavy heart. The visit had confirmed his worst fears. Richard intended to use every legal means at his disposal to regain custody of the daughters he had so callously abandoned. Not for their sake, but for the inheritance they represented. Carlos pulled out his phone and dialed Margaret Wilson. This was no longer just a custody dispute, it was war. Christmas at the Martinez estate transformed the hacienda into a haven of warmth and light against the winter chill. Carlos, who had observed the holiday with quiet dignity since his wife's passing 15 years earlier, found himself swept up in the twins' excitement as they helped Mrs. Diaz bake traditional Mexican cookies and assisted Javier in stringing lights along the porch railings. The centerpiece of their celebration was a towering pine tree harvested from the northern edge of the property, decorated with a collection of ornaments that spanned generations of Martinez history alongside new additions crafted by small hands at kindergarten. Beneath it lay presents wrapped in bright paper, far more than Carlos had initially planned, his resistance to spoiling the girls weakening with each passing day as the custody hearing loomed ever closer. "Not that one yet, Sophia," Carlos chuckled as the more impulsive twin shook a large box with her name on it. "That's for tomorrow morning." Sophia reluctantly returned the package to its place beneath the tree. "But how will Santa know we're here and not at our old house?" she asked, a sudden worry creasing her small brow. "I sent him a letter," Carlos assured her seriously. "A Marengo will make sure he finds the right chimney." Lucia, arranging a plate of cookies by the fireplace, nodded in solemn agreement. "Marengo knows everything that happens on the ranch." The twins' unwavering faith in the old stallion's protective powers had only strengthened since Richard's visitation 3 weeks earlier. They spoke to Marengo daily, confiding their fears and hopes in the gentle horse who listened with pricked ears and intelligent eyes. Dr. Parker had encouraged this ritual, explaining to Carlos that the horse represented security and unconditional acceptance to children whose trust in adults had been profoundly damaged. The second court-ordered visitation had occurred the previous weekend, with Richard once again making grand promises about the future in Seattle while showing minimal interest in the twins' current lives. He had brought expensive gifts, electronic tablets loaded with games, and a pair of designer coats that were completely impractical for ranch life. The girls had accepted these offerings with polite thanks, but left them untouched after his departure, preferring instead the simple pleasures of ranch life, riding lessons, helping with age-appropriate chores, and their growing collection of books about horses. Now, as the twins arranged cookies for Santa and argued good-naturedly about whether he preferred chocolate chip or snickerdoodle, Carlos slipped away to his study where Margaret Wilson waited with a grim expression that contrasted sharply with the festive atmosphere in the rest of the house. "Richard's attorney filed additional motions today," she said without preamble, sliding a folder across his desk. "Good. They're requesting psychological evaluations of the girls, claiming they've been alienated from their father during their time with you." Carlos's jaw tightened as he skimmed the legal documents. "That's absurd. They're wary of Richard because he abandoned them, not because of anything I've said." "I know," Margaret agreed. But it's a standard tactic in high-conflict custody cases, claiming the custodial guardian has poisoned the children against the absent parent. Judge Hernandez has denied the motion for now, but Richard's team is pushing hard. "What else?" Margaret hesitated. "They've subpoenaed Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Parker to testify about the girls' physical and psychological health when they first arrived here. They're building a narrative that Richard left the twins with you temporarily, while he dealt with his own grief and depression following Elena's death. Depression that miraculously lifted when he discovered the size of my estate," Carlos said bitterly. "Exactly, which is why we need to focus on the financial angle." Margaret pulled another document from her briefcase. "We've obtained Richard's bank records from the court. 3 days after the Cielo County Gazette ran that feature about you, updating your will to name the twins as your sole heirs, Richard contacted a high-priced custody attorney in Seattle. The timing isn't coincidental." Carlos nodded, remembering the newspaper article from early November. It had seemed harmless at the time, a human interest story about a grandfather providing for his orphaned granddaughters. He hadn't considered it might trigger Richard's greed. "The hearing is in 3 weeks," Margaret continued. "We have strong evidence of abandonment, plus the supervised visitation reports which note the twins' discomfort with Richard. But we need to be prepared for an aggressive defense. Richard will present himself as a grieving widower who made a mistake during a period of emotional distress. And now he wants a second chance," Carlos finished, the familiar anger rising in his chest. "Exactly. Our strongest counter-argument is the premeditated nature of the abandonment, the fact that he closed his business, sold their house, and moved across the country before leaving the girls here." A soft knock interrupted their strategy session. Carlos looked up to see Lucia standing in the doorway, her expression serious. "Grandpa, Sophia says we need to put carrots out for the reindeer, but Mrs. Diaz says they prefer apples, which is right." Carlos felt his expression soften immediately. "Both Misha and reindeer appreciate variety after such a long journey." Lucia nodded, accepting this wisdom without question. "That's what Marengo said too." After she departed on her important mission, Margaret smiled faintly. "They've adjusted remarkably well." "They have," Carlos agreed, "which makes Richard's sudden interest in parenting all the more despicable. He's willing to uproot them again, just as they're finding stability. The court will consider their best interests above all else," Margaret assured him, though her tone lacked the confidence Carlos hoped for. "The fact that they're thriving here works in our favor." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the Texas sky a brilliant blue canvas above the frost-touched landscape. The twins woke at an hour Carlos hadn't seen since his cattle ranching days, their excitement transforming them temporarily back into the carefree children they should always have been, unburdened by adult betrayal and legal proceedings. They tore through presents with abandon, new books, clothes for their daily ranch adventures, art supplies, and the crowning glory, custom-made Western boots with their initials tooled into the leather. A gift Carlos had commissioned months earlier from a craftsman in San Antonio. "Real cowgirl boots," Sophia squealed, immediately attempting to pull hers on over her pajamas. "Just like yours, Grandpa," Lucia observed, tracing the intricate stitching with reverent fingers. After the present opening concluded and breakfast had been consumed with unusual speed, the twins insisted on visiting Marengo, regardless of the biting cold. Bundled in new scarves and mittens, they ventured to the corral where the old stallion greeted them with his usual gentle nickering. "And to Merry Christmas, Marengo," Sophia said, offering an apple she'd saved from breakfast. "We got boots," Lucia announced, lifting her foot to display the new footwear. "Now we can be real vaqueras." Carlos watched from a respectful distance, his heart simultaneously full and aching. These moments of pure childhood joy were precisely what he was fighting to preserve, the simple happiness of belonging, of security, of knowing that tomorrow would unfold much like today, with the same people in the same beloved place. The remaining days of December slipped away in a blur of holiday rituals and legal preparations. Richard's third visitation, scheduled for the weekend after New Year's, brought fresh tension as he arrived with catalogs from private schools in Seattle and talked incessantly about the room he'd prepared for the twins in his downtown apartment. "It has a view of the Space Needle," he told them, showing pictures on his phone. "And there's an indoor pool in the building." "Do they allow horses?" Lucia asked pointedly. Richard laughed as if she'd made a charming joke. "Of course not, sweetheart, but there's a riding academy outside the city. We could visit on weekends sometimes." "Marengo wouldn't like Seattle," Sophia said quietly. "It rains too much." Richard's expression tightened momentarily before he resumed his practiced smile. "You'll make new friends. There are so many cultural opportunities, museums, theaters, the symphony." The twins exchanged one of their silent communications, a subtle shift in expression that conveyed volumes between them, but remained illegible to outsiders. "We like it here," Lucia finally said, her small voice firm. "We don't want to go to Seattle." Ms. Jenkins, the court observer, made a notation on her clipboard. 2 days before the custody hearing, a winter storm swept across Cielo County, bringing freezing rain that coated the ranch in a treacherous layer of ice. Carlos kept the twins home from school, unwilling to risk the dangerous roads. They spent the day inside, playing board games and helping Mrs. Diaz bake bread, while the wind howled and tree branches occasionally succumbed to the weight of ice with sharp cracking sounds. As dusk approached, Javier appeared at the back door, his face lined with concern beneath his frost-dusted hat. "We've got a situation with the horses," he reported. "The ice has damaged part of the south stable roof. We need to move them to the main barn." "I'll help," Carlos said immediately, reaching for his coat. "Me too," Lucia declared, Sophia nodding in agreement beside her. "No, mijas," Carlos said firmly. "It's too dangerous out there. You stay inside with Mrs. Diaz." After extracting reluctant promises from the twins to remain indoors, Carlos followed Javier into the frigid evening. The freezing rain had temporarily stopped, but the damage was done. Tree limbs sagged perilously, and every surface gleamed with treacherous ice. Their boots crunched across the frozen ground as they made their way to the south stable, where several of the ranch horses had been moved temporarily while the main barn underwent minor repairs. The damage was immediately apparent. A large branch had fallen through one corner of the roof, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. The horses inside shifted nervously, disturbed by the cold air and the strange noises of creaking ice. "We'll lead them to the main barn 2 at a time," Javier decided, already moving to halter the nearest horse. Careful on the path, it's pure ice in spots. They worked methodically, leading nervous horses across the treacherous ground between the buildings. Carlos was securing the last pair in the main barn when Mrs. Diaz's voice cut through the frozen air, her tone sharp with alarm. "Carlos!" "The girls are gone." Cold fear gripped him more severely than the winter air. "What do you mean, gone?" "They said they were going to their room to get sweaters, but when I checked, they weren't there," Mrs. Diaz explained, her breath forming frantic clouds in the frigid air. "The back door was open. I think they followed you." "Marengo," Javier said suddenly. "He's not here." "He should have been in the third stall." Understanding dawned immediately. The twins, worried about their beloved guardian, had gone looking for him in the storm. "The south pasture," Carlos said, already moving. "He sometimes goes there when ice storms come, seeks shelter in the stand of cedar trees." They split up, Carlos taking the most direct route across the frozen pasture, while Javier circled toward the cedar grove and Mrs. Diaz returned to the house in case the twins had doubled back. The winter night was rapidly darkening, the temperature plummeting as Carlos called their names, his voice seeming small against the vast, frozen landscape. A distant whinny answered him. Marengo's distinctive call. Carlos altered course, moving as quickly as he dared across the treacherous ground. As he approached the cedar grove, the stallion's call came again, more urgent this time. And then he saw them, two small figures huddled against Marengo's warm bulk beneath the protective branches of the cedars. The old horse stood over them like a sentinel, his body blocking the worst of the wind while the twins pressed against his side for warmth. "Grandpa!" Sophia called, her voice trembling with cold and relief. "Marengo found us. We got lost," Lucia explained as Carlos reached them, her usual confidence subdued by the realization of their dangerous mistake. It got dark so fast. Carlos gathered them against him, his heart pounding with fear and gratitude. "You shouldn't have come out here. It's dangerous in the ice." "We wanted to make sure Marengo was safe," Sophia said, her teeth chattering slightly despite the horse's warmth. "He wasn't in the barn. He came looking for us," Lucia added. "When we got lost, he found us and showed us where to wait." Carlos looked up at the old stallion, whose intelligent eyes seemed to hold a knowing gleam in the gathering darkness. Once again, Marengo had protected the twins when they needed him most. "Let's get you inside," Carlos said, helping the girls to their feet. "Mrs. Diaz will have hot chocolate waiting." As they made their slow, careful way back to the house, each twin holding tightly to one of his hands with Marengo following closely behind. Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that this night had somehow been significant, that Marengo's watchful presence in the twins' lives was more than coincidence. Later, after the girls had been warmed, fed, and tucked safely into bed with extra blankets and stern admonishments about never again venturing out in dangerous weather, Carlos stood at the window of his study, staring out at the icebound ranch. In the distance, he could just make out Marengo's pale form in the main barn, the stallion having refused to enter a stall, instead positioning himself near the door, as if maintaining his vigil despite the barrier of walls and distance. Tomorrow, they would drive to Austin for the custody hearing. Tomorrow, a judge would decide whether the twins would remain at the Martinez estate with their grandfather and their guardian horse, or whether they would be uprooted once more, taken to Seattle by a father whose interest in them extended only as far as their future inheritance. Carlos pressed his palm against the cold window glass, a silent prayer forming in his heart. After all the legal arguments were made, after all the evidence was presented, he hoped the judge would see what seemed so obvious here on the ranch, that Lucia and Sofia Martinez belonged at the Hacienda, where they had finally found healing, security, and unconditional love from both human and equine protectors. The Travis County Courthouse in Austin stood imposing against the January sky, its limestone facade gleaming in the winter sunlight. Inside courtroom 4B, the Martinez custody hearing had been underway for nearly 6 hours, the proceedings moving with the deliberate pace of a system designed to determine the fate of 2 small lives with methodical precision. Carlos sat rigid beside Margaret Wilson, his weathered hands clasped tightly on the table before him. Across the aisle, Richard projected the image of a successful, concerned father in an expertly tailored suit, occasionally leaning to whisper to his attorney, Veronica Hargrove, whose reputation for aggressive custody litigation had proven well-deserved throughout the day. The twins were noticeably absent, Judge Elena Hernandez having determined that 6-year-olds should not be subjected to the stress of courtroom testimony. Instead, she had conducted a private interview with them in her chambers that morning, the contents of which remained confidential. "The court calls Ms. Leslie Jenkins," the bailiff announced. The court-appointed visitation supervisor approached the witness stand, her professional demeanor firmly in place as she was sworn in. "Ms. Jenkins," Margaret began, "you've supervised 3 visits between Richard Martinez and his daughters over the past 6 weeks. Could you describe the children's demeanor during these interactions?" "The children were polite but reserved," Jenkins testified. They showed little spontaneous affection toward their father and appeared uncomfortable when he discussed plans to relocate them to Seattle. Did they express any specific concerns to you?" Margaret continued. The younger twin, Sophia, repeatedly asked if she would be returning to her grandfather's ranch after the visits. Both children mentioned someone named Marengo frequently, their grandfather's horse, I believe, and expressed worry about leaving him. "Objection," Hargrove interjected. "The children's attachment to an animal is hardly relevant to determining appropriate custody." "On the contrary," Margaret countered, "their attachment to the horse speaks directly to the stability and comfort they've found in their current environment, which is absolutely relevant to their best interests." "Overruled," Judge Hernandez stated. "The children's emotional attachments, regardless of their nature, are pertinent to this case." "Continue, Miss Wilson." "Thank you, Your Honor. Miss Jenkins, did Richard Martinez inquire about his daughters' daily lives during these visitations? Their schoolwork, their friends, their activities?" Jenkins considered the question. "Minimally, Mr. Martinez focused primarily on future plans, the schools they would attend in Seattle, activities he had researched there. He showed limited interest in their current experiences." "And did he acknowledge the trauma the children experienced when he left them at the Martinez estate last summer?" "Objection." Hargrove stood. "Counsel is characterizing the temporary placement of the children with their grandfather as trauma." "Sustained," Judge Hernandez nodded. "Rephrase, Ms. Wilson." Margaret adjusted smoothly. "Ms. Jenkins, in your professional opinion, did Richard Martinez demonstrate an understanding of his daughter's emotional needs following their separation from him?" "In my assessment, no," Jenkins replied. "Mr. Martinez appeared to minimize the impact of the separation, referring to it as a short break, despite it lasting over 3 months with no contact." The questioning continued, with Hargrove later attempting to reframe Jenkins' observations during cross-examination, suggesting the twins' reserve was the result of alienation rather than genuine discomfort. As the afternoon progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Dr. Reynolds testifying to the twins' physical health upon arrival at the ranch and their subsequent improvement. Dr. Parker carefully explaining their psychological progress without violating confidentiality. Javier Rodriguez describing how he found the abandoned children and their integration into ranch life. "The transformation has been remarkable," Javier stated, his usually taciturn manner giving way to passionate advocacy. "When they arrived, they were frightened, confused children. Now they're thriving, riding horses, helping with age-appropriate chores, excelling in school." When Richard finally took the stand, he presented a carefully crafted narrative of temporary emotional breakdown following his wife's death, claiming he had left the twins with his father only until he could establish a stable environment in Seattle. "I never intended to abandon my daughters," he insisted, his voice breaking with what Carlos recognized as practiced emotion. "I've always wanted what's best for them. Now that I've secured our future in Seattle, I can provide them with every advantage, the finest schools, cultural opportunities, a comfortable lifestyle." "Mr. Martinez," Margaret asked during cross-examination, "prior to leaving your daughters at your father's ranch, did you sell your home in Austin?" "Yes, and did you close your real estate business and accept a position in Seattle?" "That was part of creating a better future for..." "A simple yes or no will suffice, Mr. Martinez." "Yes." "Did you leave any contact information with your daughters or your father when you departed?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "No. In fact, the note you left specifically instructed not to attempt to contact you, did it not?" "I was not in a good place emotionally. Yet you were organized enough to sell your home, close your business, and relocate across the country," Margaret observed. "That suggests considerable advanced planning, wouldn't you agree?" Before Richard could respond, Margaret changed direction. "Mr. Martinez, when did you first learn that your father had updated his will to name your daughters as his sole heirs?" "Objection," Hargrove called. "Irrelevant." "Your Honor," Margaret countered, "the timing of Mr. Martinez's sudden interest in reclaiming his daughters is directly relevant to his motivation." "I'll allow it," Judge Hernandez ruled. "The witness will answer." Richard's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. "I don't recall exactly. Was it perhaps after the Cielo County Gazette ran an article about it on November 3rd of last year?" "Possibly." Margaret approached the bench, presenting a document to the judge before handing copies to Richard and his attorney. "This is a phone record showing that on November 4th, the day after that article was published, you contacted Ms. Hargrove's office." "Is that correct?" Richard stared at the document, his jaw working. "Yes. Prior to that date, more than 2 months after leaving your daughters, had you made any attempt to contact them or inquire about their welfare?" "No, but..." "And would you estimate the value of your father's estate, including the Martinez Ranch and his various investments, to be approximately $25 million? Richard's expression hardened. "I wouldn't know the exact figure. Yet 3 days after learning your daughters would inherit this substantial estate, you hired one of Seattle's most expensive custody attorneys. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say?" "Objection." Hargrove was on her feet. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Withdrawn," Margaret said smoothly. "The damage already done." "No further questions, Your Honor." As Richard stepped down, his composed mask had slipped enough to reveal the calculation beneath. Carlos caught his son's eye briefly, seeing not grief or love or concern for his daughters, but the cold fury of a man whose schemes were being exposed. After both attorneys delivered their closing arguments, Hargrove emphasizing the legal preference for biological parents, Margaret focusing on the twins, best interests, and the suspicious timing of Richard's renewed interest. Judge Hernandez called a 30-minute recess before delivering her ruling. In the courthouse hallway, Carlos stood by a tall window, gazing out at the Austin skyline while Margaret reviewed her notes. "And you did everything you could," she told him quietly. Now it's in Judge Hernandez's hands. Carlos nodded, his thoughts with the twins who were spending the day with Mrs. Diaz at a friend's house in Austin, blissfully unaware that their future was being decided in this cold, formal building. "Beam, whatever happens," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "those girls deserve better than to be valued only for their inheritance." When the bailiff called them back into the courtroom, Carlos felt a strange calm settle over him. He had presented the truth. He had fought with every resource at his disposal. Now, whatever the outcome, he would continue to love his granddaughters and do whatever possible to protect them. Judge Hernandez, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and penetrating eyes, looked between the two parties before speaking. "Custody cases are among the most difficult this court addresses," she began. "Our primary concern must always be the best interests of the children involved, not the desires or convenience of the adults who claim them." She shuffled through her notes before continuing. "I have reviewed all testimony and evidence presented. I have interviewed Lucia and Sofia Martinez privately. I have considered the relevant statutes regarding parental rights and the factors that may justify their limitation." The courtroom was utterly silent, both Carlos and Richard leaning forward slightly. "Mr. Richard Martinez, your decision to leave your daughters at your father's ranch last summer with no contact information and explicit instructions not to be contacted constitutes abandonment under Texas Family Code, Section 161.01. While you characterize this as a temporary arrangement during a period of emotional distress, your actions, selling your home, closing your business, and relocating across the country, suggest premeditation inconsistent with your testimony. Richard's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the timing of your renewed interest in custody, coinciding precisely with public knowledge of your daughter's inheritance prospects, raises significant concerns about your motivation." She turned to Carlos. "Mr. Carlos Martinez, you have provided a stable, loving home for your granddaughters during a traumatic transition. The evidence shows the children are thriving in your care. Multiple witnesses have testified to their improved emotional health and adjustment." Judge Hernandez closed her folder deliberately. "Having considered all factors, including the children's expressed wishes during our private conversation, I hereby grant permanent legal and physical custody of Lucia and Sofia Martinez to their grandfather, Carlos Martinez." Carlos closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by relief. "Mr. Richard Martinez will be granted supervised visitation twice monthly to be reviewed in 1 year's time." The judge fixed Richard with a stern gaze. "Should you demonstrate consistent interest in your daughters' lives and well-being beyond their financial prospects, this court will consider modifying the visitation schedule accordingly." With a sharp rap of her gavel, it was done. Carlos felt Margaret's hand on his shoulder, heard her quiet congratulations, but his focus had already shifted to the twins, to sharing the news that they were staying home permanently. Richard stormed out without speaking, Hargrove trailing behind with promises of appeal that everyone present knew would likely go nowhere. The evidence had been too damning, the judge's reasoning too sound. The drive back to Cielo County passed in a blur of phone calls to Mrs. Diaz, to Javier, to Dr. Parker, each conversation reinforcing the reality that the fight was over. The twins were coming home. Dusk was settling over the Martinez estate as Carlos's truck turned up the long driveway. He had picked up the twins from their day in Austin, their initial disappointment at missing the hearing giving way to jubilation when they learned the outcome. "Forever?" Sofia had asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We stay with you forever?" "Forever, mija," Carlos had confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. Now, as the hacienda came into view, bathed in the golden light of sunset, he watched through the rearview mirror as the twins pressed their faces to the windows, their expressions reflecting the purest form of homecoming joy. "Look!" Lucia exclaimed suddenly. "Marengo's waiting for us?" Sure enough, the old stallion stood at the fence nearest the driveway, his white coat glowing in the fading light, his attention fixed on the approaching truck with the uncanny awareness that had marked his relationship with the twins from the beginning. Carlos had barely brought the vehicle to a stop before the twins were unbuckling their seatbelts, tumbling out of the truck with the eager energy of children secure in the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. "Marengo, we won! We're staying!" Sophia called as they raced toward the fence. Carlos followed more slowly, his heart full as he watched his granddaughters throw their arms around the stallion's neck, their identical faces alight with happiness as they shared their news with the horse who had, in many ways, made it all possible. "He knew already," Lucia declared with absolute certainty as Carlos joined them. "But Marengo always knows everything. Is that right?" Carlos smiled, reaching out to stroke the stallion's grey-speckled mane. Marengo nickered softly, pressing his muzzle briefly against Carlos's shoulder before returning his attention to the twins, who were now detailing every aspect of their day in Austin, complete with dramatic reenactments. In that moment, watching his granddaughters with the horse who had become their self-appointed guardian, Carlos understood something profound about family, that it wasn't always formed by blood or legal documents, but by the invisible bonds of love and protection that linked souls together. 6 months ago, Richard Martinez had abandoned his daughters at the hacienda's fence, driving away without a backward glance, believing he was finally free of an unwanted responsibility. He couldn't have known that in that moment, he wasn't destroying his daughters' future, but delivering them to it, to a home where they would be valued for themselves, not for their inheritance, to a grandfather who would cherish every moment with them, to a community that would embrace them, and to an aging stallion whose mysterious instinct for protection had turned abandonment into salvation. "Come on, mijas," Carlos said, extending his hands to the twins. "Mrs. Diaz is making your favorite enchiladas to celebrate." As they walked toward the house, hand in hand, the twins paused to look back at Marengo, who remained at the fence, his steadfast silhouette outlined against the deepening twilight. "Good night, Marengo," they called in unison. "See you tomorrow." The horse tossed his head in what Carlos had come to recognize as acknowledgement, a gesture that seemed to say, "I'll be here, always." And he would be. Carlos knew, for as long as his old heart continued to beat, Marengo would watch over Lucia and Sofia Martinez, the twins who had been left behind only to find where they truly belonged. On the porch, Mrs. Diaz waited with Javier, their faces wreathed in smiles. Light spilled from the windows of the hacienda, warm and welcoming against the gathering darkness. The Martinez estate, once threatened with becoming merely another asset in a custody battle fueled by greed, had transformed back into what it was always meant to be, a home, a haven, a place where the next generation of Martinezes would grow and thrive, guided by love and protected by both human and equine guardians. As they crossed the threshold together, the twins still chattering excitedly about the day's events, Carlos sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for small miracles, and for the mysterious wisdom of an old white horse who had witnessed an abandonment and transformed it into a homecoming.